What are some misconceptions about Islam that people have? Well, there's plenty to talk about, but here are 6 that I feel are completely wrong and need to be corrected. Hopefully, by the end of this video, you will learn something new or maybe even consider becoming Muslim yourself. Who knows? Without further ado, let's get started. The first misconception is that Islam is a religion of war and violence. This is probably the most common misconception about Islam and Muslims, and it's usually due to how the media portrays Muslims and Islam. If you look at the news, you only see Muslims associated with violence. For example, terrorism, wars in Muslim countries, etc. But what they don't show you is that the vast majority of victims of war and terrorism are actually Muslims themselves. For example, since the start of the Syrian civil war, which is the worst humanitarian crisis of our time, it's estimated that over 500,000 Syrian Muslims have been killed, not to mention millions more injured or gone missing. And yet, despite all these tragedies, Muslims continue to be portrayed in the media as if they're inherently violent. So, what's the origin of this misconception? Well, Allah spoke about that in the Qur'an. He says, "O humanity, indeed we created you from a male and a female, and made you into peoples and tribes so that you may get to know one another. Surely the most noble of you in the sight of God is the most righteous among you." When Allah spoke about creating humans from a male and a female, He was referring to Adam and Eve. And when He said, "made you into peoples and tribes," He was referring to the children of Ishmael, who were the ancestors of Arabs. And when He said, "so that you may get to know one another," He was referring to the different cultures, languages, religions, and other differences that exist between people. Basically, Allah is telling us that all humans are equal and that no one is superior or inferior to another based on their race, ethnicity, gender, etc. However, because of that, Allah says that the most noble of humans are those who are the most righteous. What does being righteous mean? It means that you're obedient to Allah and that you're kind and helpful to others. So, the next time you hear or see something about terrorism or violence in the news, remember that the vast majority of victims are innocent Muslims just like you and me. And also, remember that the perpetrators of these acts are not true Muslims because Islam teaches us to be peaceful and to help those in need, not to harm them. The second misconception is that Islam is a religion for Arabs only. Allah says in the Qur'an, "We have certainly sent you as a mercy for the worlds." So Islam is meant for everyone, Arabs and non-Arabs alike. And in fact, the first Muslim was a non-Arab. His name was Abdullah ibn Salam. He was a Jew, but he became Muslim after hearing about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the message of Islam. In addition to that, the majority of Muslims today are not Arabs. In fact, less than 20% of Muslims worldwide are Arabs. The largest Muslim population is in Indonesia, followed by Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Egypt. So, whenever you meet someone Muslim, don't just assume that they're Arab or from the Middle East. They could be from anywhere in the world. The third misconception is that in Islam, women are treated poorly. Unfortunately, this misconception exists in many parts of the world, especially in the West. People see how some Muslim men treat their wives and think that this is part of Islam. But that couldn't be any further from the truth. Islam actually gives women a lot of rights. For example, women have the right to own property, to work, to travel, to refuse a marriage proposal, to initiate a divorce, to choose their spouse, etc. In fact, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, once said, "A woman can't be forced into marriage against her will." This was over 1400 years ago. Imagine how progressive that was. Sadly, though, some Muslim men don't treat their wives properly. And this is not because of Islam, but rather because of their own ignorance. Let me tell you a story about a man called Jubair ibn Mut'imir. He once came to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and asked him, "Which act of charity is the best?" The Prophet replied, "To feed a poor person who is hungry." Jubair then asked, "What if she's an orphan?" The Prophet said, The same, to feed a poor person who is hungry. Jubair continued asking until the Prophet gave the same answer every time. Finally, Jubair asked, "What if she's a destitute woman?" The Prophet replied, "The same, to feed a poor person who is hungry." Then Jubair got angry and said, "You only care about food. What about clothing?" To that, the Prophet said, "Do you think that's enough for a destitute woman?" Jubair said, "What else should I give her?" The Prophet then told him, "Give her whatever she asks for." After hearing that, Jubair went out and found a poor woman. He gave her money so she could buy whatever she needed, including clothes. He then returned to the Prophet and told him everything he had done. The Prophet said, "You have done a great thing, O Jubair, except that you have deprived yourself of a tenfold reward." "Why is that?" Jubair asked. The Prophet replied, "You didn't spend anything on your family, nor did you give anything to your children." Jubair became very sad after hearing that. He realized that he had been selfish and wasn't thinking of anyone but himself. He then went back to the woman and asked her, "Can I give you something else instead?" She said, "Yes, you can give me anything." So Jubair took his precious cloak and gave it to her. The Prophet had told him that the best charity was to give to a poor person who is hungry, and he knew that she needed a cloak to cover up. He then returned to the Prophet and told him what he had done. The Prophet Muhammad said, "By him in whose hand is my soul, you will be given a cloak better than this one, and it will be made of silk." So Jubair's reward was multiplied because he had shown kindness to the destitute woman. Not only did he feed her, but he also gave her a cloak. The point of this story is that Islam encourages Muslims to be kind and generous to those in need, especially women. In fact, Islam considers taking care of the poor and needy as one of the most important things a Muslim can do. The fourth misconception is that in Islam, you can only worship God. This is another misconception that people have about Islam, especially Christians. They think that Muslims don't believe in Jesus, peace be upon him, and that they only worship Allah. But the reality is that Muslims believe in all the prophets of Allah, including Jesus, peace be upon him. In fact, Muslims believe that Jesus is the Messiah, son of Mary, and that he will come again before the Day of Judgment. However, Muslims do not believe that Jesus is God. They believe that he is a prophet of God, just like Abraham, Moses, and Muhammad, peace be upon them all. To say that Muslims only worship God is not entirely wrong. In fact, it's part of the Shahada, which is the declaration of faith in Islam. The Shahada is what makes someone Muslim. If someone says, "There is no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger," then he or she becomes Muslim. But that doesn't mean that Muslims don't believe in other prophets. It just means that they believe that Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last and final prophet of God. The fifth misconception is that all Muslims are extremists. This is a common misconception that people have about Islam, especially in the West. People see how some Muslims are against things like homosexuality, abortion, etc., and think that all Muslims are like that. But the reality is that Muslims have different opinions on many things. Just like people of other religions and beliefs, not all Muslims are extremists. In fact, most Muslims are quite moderate. However, there are some Muslims who are extremists and they cause problems for the rest of the Muslim community. These extremists usually don't represent the true teachings of Islam, and their actions only cause more hate and division between Muslims and non-Muslims. The sixth misconception is that Islam is a new religion. This is another misconception that people have about Islam. Many people think that Islam is a new religion, but the reality is that it's one of the oldest religions in the world. It was revealed to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in the year 610 CE, which makes it over 1400 years old. Even though it's a relatively new religion for most people, considering that most of the world was Christian or Jewish at the time, it still has a rich history that dates back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So those were 6 misconceptions about Islam that I believe are completely wrong. If you enjoyed this video, then please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to learn more about Islam, then I highly recommend checking out the links in the description below. Thanks for watching.